Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Wall of Power TV. I'm your host, Paul Metsa. We have a great show tonight with a couple of superb guests. There's a new book out called Hijinks and Hearsay, Scenester Stories from Minnesota's Pop Life. We have the man that wrote the text and was there for a lot of this history, Mr. Martin Keller, and a photographer who's been on the scene for as long as Marty has, and that's a long time, Greg Helgeson. The book, Hijinks and Hearsay, was recently published by the Minnesota Historical Society Press, who's doing a great job, and they also have a great exhibit over in St. Paul at their building about the history of First Avenue. And so, without any further ado, I would like to introduce my guests, who many refer to as the Spud Boys. We'll find out about that. Writer Marty Keller, Greg Helgeson, great photographer. Greg, I haven't seen you in a long time. Good to see you again.
Likewise.
So Hijinks and Hearsay, where did this whole thing start?
Well, we saw all these books coming out about the history of the independent rock scene, and we looked at
Minneapolis
in Minneapolis
70s and 80s, yeah.
Yeah, and there were similar books around the country. And we thought, we should do a book that's a little more personal, that captures the era before all these big things exploded.
Right.
That period that we worked in from the late 70s to the early 90s, there were some pretty interesting things happening. We refer to it as the last of the analog era. It was literally 10 years before the digital tsunami hit.
Right.
And changed everything, every business model out there. Prince and his Paisley Park kingdom were on the rise. You had all these independent bands like The Replacement, Husker Du, and others that were rapidly getting national attention. And you also had a really overheated independent comedy scene.
Right.
That was also happening around the country, and simultaneously the rise of the Prairie Home Companion franchise over in St. Paul with Mr. Keeler was kind of in parallel to all these things.
What a really exciting, explosive time when you think about it.
I think it was. We often thought to ourselves, are we just having a great time, or is this going to mean anything in 5 years,
Right.
10 years, 15 years?
And is every town like this?
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, Bob Mira, who's a great writer who wrote Trouble Boys, the story of the Replacements, did the foreword to the book, and he refers to you two as the Spud Boys. Now,
Spud Boys.
Spud
yeah.
Boys.
Spud Boys, yeah. So tell the younger folks in the Wall of Power TV audience where that came from.
Go ahead, kick it off.
Well, I'd say it just came from working for a pseudo farm journal title, which was Sweet Potato. And
Which was the forerunner to City Pages.
right, there was a East Coast version of it and then ours, and locally. When we started working for it, it was always kind of an odd name, but of course it's a musical instrument.
Right.
But nobody knew
An
that.
ocarina, so
Yeah.
2 strikes against you right away. Nobody knows what the hell that is either.
You take part 2.
So, we were the first employees of Sweet Potato. There were no freelance budgets to speak of.
Right.
And we not only reported, edited, photographed, helped produce the paper, we also ended up delivering it in our not always reliable cars. And we sort of derisively and fondly started calling it the Spud.
Right.
And we started referring to each other as Spud Boys, and it's kind of a nickname that's hung with us over the years.
Let's start right at the top. Probably, I'd have to think one of your biggest personal moments, interviewing, before he was Sir Paul McCartney, Paul McCartney.
Right, and besides City Pages and Sweet Potato, Greg and I worked for a number of years at the competition, the Twin Cities Reader. I mean, how many towns have 2 really good alternative weeklies? I mean, that was a luxury that I think people took for granted at the time. I look back on it now and I go, wow, that's just
incredible.
That shouldn't happen.
Yeah.
But we were offered the chance to go down to Ames, Iowa, for the Paul McCartney concert. It was the second leg of his 1989 world tour.
Flowers in the Dirt.
Yeah, was it the Flowers in the Dirt
Yeah.
thing?
Yep.
And it was the first, and this particular gig was at the Cyclone Stadium, Ames, Iowa, and it was the first time McCartney was playing Beatles songs, you know, through the whole Wings period and all that. He pretty much disdained that.
Right.
You know, we were lucky enough to get in. I got in the front row somehow for the press conference. Greg got a beautiful candid shot of McCartney and Linda and Wix Wickham backstage where he's hamming it up like this.
Right.
And I got to ask the first question, even though I hadn't really prepared any. I didn't think there's no way, because there were 40 other journalists
Right.
in the room. But you know, when you're in the front row and Paul McCartney looks at you and goes, "This guy right here," you got to throw him something. So,
What was the question?
well, I said, how did he like America? What was his impression of America these days? I mean, a total softball, mushy-mouthed question that didn't really even demand a good answer. And
Right.
he was sort of shrugged it off and goes, "You know, I like America. You know, I married one." And
Right.
after like 10 or 15 minutes, he was looking across the room for another question, and he looked at me again. And I thought, well, I'm gonna float another one. I
Sure.
said, "So, do you listen to any rap? Do you like rap music?"
Right.
And he cocks his eyebrow and he goes, "Let others have a turn now." And then he called somebody else out. But
Greg, what was that like? I'm guessing, around the same age. Did you see the Beatles on Ed Sullivan?
Of course, yep.
So what was that like photographing Paul McCartney?
Surreal.
Yeah.
I mean, there were a lot of acts that you could be in front of it that you didn't really, you were amazed, but at the same time, I think I mentioned in the book, in the cut line Marty put in there, that there were two instances where knees got a little wobbly or jello, and it was Jagger sticking his face in my lens and McCartney backstage. And I talked to him briefly about the damnedest things, probably nervous to talk to him about his brother,
Right.
Mike, because I had
Okay.
spent a couple hours with him in London in the late 70s at a pub one night, and Mike covered all kinds of stuff, it was pretty cool. So you get these people that are part of you growing up, right, that you're just devastated by how great they are and big fans of it, and then they're right in front of you, and you're fighting the logic of being nervous or not.
The Bob Marley tape was so intriguing to me because I saw that Northrop show in 1979. Literally, you felt like you were in the presence of greatness. I mean,
Sure.
And it was beyond that. There was a spiritual element to Bob Marley. What was it like being in his hotel room?
the sound check was kind of a revelation. The sound check produced a moment that I've never experienced before and probably won't again. The band got into this space where everybody, and I mean everybody, including the roadies on the stage, hooking it still, checking wires and amps, and me and some other ushers types in Northrop in the auditorium, literally stopped in their tracks because something was happening with the sound that it didn't seem to be in time. It seemed to be out of time and space. Mm-hmm. It was this weird mystical groove. And I don't know if your viewers have ever read the definitive Marley biography by Tim White. Tim says early on in the book, he says, I saw and experienced things around Bob Marley and other Rastafarians that I could never explain in a practical, Western, logical way. Yeah. He says, I called it magic, but it was really coming from someplace else, and that was the feeling I got standing in that moment in the Northrop Auditorium listening to the sound check.
We've got Martin Keller and Greg Helgeson on for the whole show tonight on Wall of Power TV, talking about their great new book published by the Minnesota Historical Society Press called Hijinks and Hearsay. We'll be back after these messages.
I want you to meet Two Gingers Irish Whiskey. I'm Kieran and I'm Irish, so I tend to like a challenge. Why not? I wanted a whiskey to help find me out what's out there. like what's really out there. And I found the oldest distillery in Ireland with a water wheel and awards for its small family of whiskies in the middle of Ireland. As I've always seen it, you can't win the lottery unless you buy a ticket. So try it. The investment is small and the flavor is big. It's perfect for drinking neat. Its character holds up, like the Irish, when the bastards try to get you down. Two Gingers Irish whiskey, distilled twice for more character, time for more flavor, and less of the old burn. No lite bastardes carborundum. Don't let the bastards get you down.
Welcome back to Wall of Power TV. I'm your host, Paul Metsa. We have two great artists in the studio tonight talking about the book they worked on together, Hijinks and Hearsay, a scenester's look at Twin Cities pop life in the 70s and 80s. Martin Keller and Greg Helgeson. Greg's the photographer. Marty wrote the text. Greg, how many photos are in this book?
Help.
150.
Wow.
He'd know, yeah. That sounds right now that he said that.
How many photos did you go through to figure out which ones you were going to use?
No idea. All I know is I started scanning images about 2011 and didn't stop till probably a month before they would be submitted.
Wow.
And I'm still not done. I mean, but I won't go back. There's enough of that,
How did you figure out which stories and which artists you were going to put the spotlight on?
That's a good question. There are 41 chapters. I think of them more as vignettes, because this is sort of I call it a fragmented memoir in our introduction to the Meet the Spud Boys section. We had to have a good photograph. We had to have a good backstory with the photograph, and in most cases we wanted to have an interview be part of the original reporting. So it's more talking, it's not feeding back the reporting, it's more like, well, what happened when you were with Bob Marley in the Radisson Hotel and he rolls up a illegal cigarette about that big and shares it with everyone.
A left-handed cigarette, as we
a
call it in the
left-handed
business.
cigarette, yeah. What was it like watching Joel Hodgson, who co-created Mystery Science Theater 3000, emerge from the comedic pack that was part of that whole 80s comedy scene here that exploded.
Talk about, Marty, the comedy scene back then. That's what one of the things I like about this book. You've got the music covered, but also the rise of the comedic scene.
Yeah. Well, the comedy scene obviously Dudley Riggs is kind of the godfather of the Minneapolis comedy into the modern period.
Well, in one of the oldest comedy shops, I think predating Second City in Chicago.
That might be true.
Yeah.
But they did a lot of what's called sketch comedy.
Yeah.
They pre-wrote shows and then they'd put them on. But stand-up comedy is a little different fish. Jeff Gerbino really started the scene at Mickey Finn's, which is in the Labor Temple on Hennepin, just across the bridge, and then sort of bequeathed it to Scott Hansen, who literally became the king of comedy clubs.
Right.
I think Scott at one time had 5 clubs going in the Twin Cities alone, and then he and his brother and one other guy were booking comedy from Alabama to Winnipeg.
Wow.
Corporate events and college campuses.
Right.
And you're right. I mean, you could go see somebody like Jay Leno, who eventually took over the Carson show, in a small little room when nobody knew who this funny-looking talking guy from Boston was. Jerry Seinfeld was hanging around here a lot. He was close friends with Joel Hodgson, and Greg's got a wonderful photograph of them in the book. And Joel's looking into the mirror. So we see the back of his head, but his face reflected in this little round mirror. I mean, it's such a dynamic photograph. I mean, you maybe talk about how you got him to do that, but I mean, you could see these guys in clubs, Louis Anderson, Wild Bill Bauer.
Let me jump in with Louis Anderson. First of all, when you said mirrors, reminded me I spent an incredible night with Sam Kinison and Tom Arnold on 26th of Lyndale. before Sam blew up. But a really incredible show for my 22nd birthday. My girlfriend at the time, Prudence Johnson, took me to see Paul Krasner, who is the editor of The Realist, and
Godfather of the alternative press.
yeah, and one of the founding fathers of the Yippie Party, also a roommate of Lenny Bruce's. Opening act for Paul Krasner at Dudley Riggs, etc., a young Louis Anderson.
It was a wonderful time for comedy. There's a whole chapter about Louis and Joel and Jerry, Joel Hodgson and Jerry Seinfeld and Scott Hansen. Who else is in there? Liz Winstead,
Right,
lest
love
we
Liz.
forget, co-creator of The Daily Show.
Partied at Liz's place in Kenwood.
She was a rock and roll, self-described rock and roll chick.
Yeah.
Loved worship at the altar of Prince.
Yeah.
There's a whole vignette about her in there and some great photographs. But then, of course, this guy took.
What I love, not like what I love about this book. So number one, I've been a big fan of Martin Keller's for years. For his writing, he has such a personal way of telling a story. You feel like, the reader feels like they're right in the room while it's happening. So Greg, did you two, the Spud Boys, did you go on a lot of these gigs together, or did you get your photos here and Marty had his interviews there and eventually they coalesced into Hijinks and Hearsay?
Well, it was really both. Sometimes it'd be interview and I'd sit back and shoot photos while the interviews were going. I wasn't crazy about doing that, but it's always all kind of insurance. But more than likely I would wait things out and then just do them on my own accord as time allowed. Usually it would be, the writers would get 40 minutes and I'd get 10.
Were there ever moments when you're driving back home to either take the film to get developed or you develop it yourself, I hope to God it's in here?
Oh, yeah,
Was there
always.
anything that ever got erased?
Always. I'm surprised I didn't have an anxiety attacks about
Yeah.
something like that, because back then with film, there were occasions where you'd shoot and all of a sudden the film would lock up in the back of the camera and the back would pop open.
Right.
And that happened with me rarely, but it was always a worry. It happened to me, I think, on one occasion with the replacements. And to this day, that mistake turned into an interesting photo. It got fogged, but it's kind of arty.
You know
So I
what I
take
love-
it what I can.
Yeah, what I love about the book is you have not only the local luminaries that went on, like Husker Du and the Replacements and Suburbs that went on to be nationally acclaimed, and all the national stuff, but you even covered people that nobody knew about, and to this day probably don't. I'm turning the pages, and I remember when there was an article about yours truly in, was it City Pages? I believe my first record came out. And you guys were nice enough to include a photo of me back then. And if you remember, Greg, it was in the laundry room at my apartment at 441 Ridgewood.
I was going to say, I thought it was at your apartment, but I couldn't remember.
Yeah.
Didn't remember the location for sure.
Yeah, 441 Ridgewood.
We played with whatever we could.
Yeah.
Which is what I always did with any photo. Planning ahead. You just walked in there and you looked around, ascertained what would look good and graphically would fit, and that big mirror and
Yeah.
your sunglasses were two elements.
Still don't have the big mirror. Still use the sunglasses part of my
I
shtick.
think the cool thing about Greg's photos, and Bob Mayer touches on this a little bit in his foreword, is that Greg had a really unassuming presence about him.
Absolutely.
That allowed him to kind of almost be invisible in the room and get these really personal and interesting photographs. I mean, none of it was planned.
Right.
That was his shooting style, as you described it to me. It was just kind of go with what's happening. There's a wonderful photo of Terry Lewis and Jimmy Jam where they're high stepping at him.
Right.
I mean, that took what, maybe 5 minutes to shoot?
No, actually, a lot of times what would appear to be an interview thing where you get 10 minutes, most of the time I spend at least an hour or more with people. In most cases, I would get there on time and just kind of check things out. And Jimmy and Terry that time, that was over at the old Guthrie, upstairs in the hallway. I used to use that area as my studio space because I hated studio space.
There's all that white space in there.
That was the white walls in the
Yeah.
window, and to me it was the perfect light. Even on a cloudy day, it was great. So we would go up there. Jimmy, I think, drove his new Corvette. I think at the time he had a brand new Corvette. There's other photos of him.
Was it little and red?
No, it was big and one of those
That
newer
was Prince's
versions.
car.
Oh,
Yeah.
that's right.
No, so yeah, you just go in there and then I'd always watch them and see what I thought would fit. And then you cooperate and you let them be themselves, bottom line. You always did that.
We've got Martin Keller, great writer, been working in town for 35 years. Greg Helgeson, we're talking about their book, Hijinks and Hearsay, on Wall of Power TV. I'm your host, Paul Metsa. We're going to be back with more stories, and I've got some questions I need to ask these two cats.
Anchor Fish and Chips has been run by the Hayes family since 2009 in beautiful northeast Minneapolis. They are known as the home of delicious, freshly prepared fish and chips. The best damn hangover cure in the Twin Cities. Burgers, veggies, shepherd's pie, Alaskan cod with hand-cut chips make your visit fun and memorable. Anchor Fish and Chips, serving the heart of northeast Minneapolis at 302 13th Avenue Northeast. Please tell them the Iron Range Folk Singers sent you.
Welcome back to Wall of Power TV. I'm your host, Paul Metsa. There's no way we can talk about your book without mentioning Prince.
I first met Prince when he was on the kitchen floor of Bobby Z's uptown apartment near Lake Calhoun, as it was called then.
Right.
He was amazingly shy. At first I thought it was an act, but the longer I sat on the floor with him because I thought I can't talk down to the guy on the floor if I'm going to interview him. But he was very shy. I hardly got any quotes out of him.
Was his first Warner Brothers record?
Yeah, it was right on the release of that in '79. And then, of course, I had many encounters with him through the next decade and a half. I was the guy you can blame for his royal badness handle that I laid on him in one of my columns. Still hear it used today, nationally, internationally. Then did a really great sit-down interview with him in '96, I think.
About that, yeah.
Right after the Emancipation record.
Do you have some of the stuff still on cassette?
Well,
These interviews?
the '90s interview, at that point, Prince had outlawed any use of tape or note-taking, which, if you're a journalist, well, even if you're an artist, you're putting yourself at risk.
Right.
Because you're going to be misquoted eventually. Right. But he said so many profound things that afternoon out at Paisley that I just, once the interview was over, I ran back to the car and wrote them down on my notepad. And he was, it was a side of him I hadn't seen really before. He was happily married at the time. He shunned all of the rock star trip that he'd been on. He was really kind of in a very spiritual place, and he had such a warm smile when he wasn't being Prince, the artist, just being himself. He was just a lovable,
the cool cat from the north side.
Yep.
You've got tens of thousands of photographs and negatives. In this book, Hijinks and Hearsay, are there any that are a little more special than the others?
Boy, that's a good question. I know, oddly enough, I come up with stuff like the Seinfeld photo and McGuinn, Clark, and Hillman, Ian Hunter from Mott the Hoople, or Ian Hunter solo. Things like that come, and Dr. Seuss.
That is a great photo.
William Burroughs, some of those kind of...
Dr. Seuss is classic. Great shoes.
I'd have to see the book again to remember.
Yeah.
But yeah,
there are 3 different galleries of just photo collections, including some of what people now disparagingly call geezer rock. So there's a whole section of geezer rockers.
But no yacht rock, just geezer rock.
Yeah, that's right.
But beyond the comedy and the rock and roll, you also had a young guy named Garrison Keillor who was making his way onto the radio airwaves. Talk about that great picture of Garrison and your interactions with Keeler over the years.
I interviewed Garrison, I think when his first book came out, and he was just starting to break nationally. I'd been a fan of his since college because he was on the first Minnesota public radio station was on my college campus.
St. John's
St.
University.
John's University, up in a little tower at the quadrangle on campus.
Right.
So we'd see him a lot coming and going, and we'd see him in St. Joe in the bars drinking cheap beer at night.
And that was early 70s?
That was yeah,
Late seven or
mid
no, early-
70s.
Mid-70s, okay.
Early to mid 70s. And so I was a fan of his radio show that he used to broadcast every morning, the morning show. And then I watched him transform that into Prairie Home. And it was an interesting interview. You know, at the end of it, he started to interview me. Found out I was a Catholic and an altar boy and all that, and that I liked satire. And he, you know, before I left, he goes, you know, you should really start going to Mass again and read Mad Magazine. Start reading Mad Magazine again. I went, all right, Garrison, thanks for those words of wisdom.
We know him now as Bob Dylan. There's a great photo of him and his family at McAllister.
That's
Yeah.
all Greg.
Yeah, that was just happenstance.
Serendipitous.
Yep, I think I got maybe 2 frames off before the family went, surrounded him like a covered wagon type.
And who was graduating?
His daughter,
Oldest daughter, Maria.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah,
Who ended up marrying Peter Himmelman?
right,
Right.
I think in a way what you two have done along with Josh Leventhal and the other great crew at the Minnesota Historical Society Press is captured a time when independent journalism and alternative weeklies were at their peak.
I think that's right. It really was an end of an era. I think personally, and from my perspective, it was also the end of the true alternative press. You know, the Reader was eventually bought by its competitor, City Pages, and put out of business the same week with no warning. 32 people lost jobs that week. It was an end of an era in a lot of ways, not just, you know, the end of the analog period, the end of access, long access to artists, comics, etc. And I don't think we really realized that until we looked back and went, wow, we were lucky.
took time.
Right. Marty Keller, Greg Helgeson, thank you so much. To all of you out there in the Wall of Power TV audience, go get this book, especially if you grew up in this time or you're younger and you've heard about this time. This book with the photos and Marty's text tells the story. Thanks, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thanks, Greg. All right. Thanks for watching Wall of Power TV. We love bringing these kinds of stories and these kinds of human beings every week. We're on same time next week, same station. We'll save you a seat.